This signature will destroy your company. The words didn't echo. They cut. Clean. Precise. And then everything stopped. The air inside the 27th floor boardroom went still, like someone had sealed the windows and pulled the oxygen out. Daniel Whitmore's hand froze midair, his Montblanc pen hovering less than an inch above a $200 million contract. The soft hum of the city outside, the traffic 12 stories below, the distant sirens, the low vibration of Manhattan life, faded into nothing. All that remained was silence. A heavy, watching silence. Slowly, heads turned. One by one. Suits shifting. Leather chairs creaking. Eyes narrowing. Not toward the head of the table. Not toward the legal team. Toward the glass wall. Toward her. Alicia Brooks stood near the edge of the room, half in shadow, a microfiber cloth still folded in her hand. The faint scent of cleaning solution clung to her uniform. Her sneakers were damp, leaving soft, fading prints across the polished marble floor. She hadn't meant to be seen. People like her weren't supposed to be seen in rooms like this. Who let her in? Someone muttered, low but sharp. A faint chuckle followed. Another voice, quieter, colder. She's maintenance. Alicia didn't move, didn't apologize, didn't step back. Her eyes stayed locked, not on the men, but on the paper, on the contract, on line 32. Daniel's gaze followed theirs, slow, deliberate. He didn't look at her at first. He looked at the interruption, at the disruption, at the audacity. Then, finally, his eyes lifted, met hers, and for a brief second, just a flicker, something unfamiliar crossed his face. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to curiosity. Or warning. Say that again, he said, voice calm, controlled, but tighter now. Alicia stepped forward. One step. That was all. The sound of her shoe against the marble echoed louder than it should have. This clause, she said quietly, her voice steady, almost gentle, it transfers full liability to your company if anything goes wrong after the merger. A pause. A longer one this time. Then laughter. Not loud. Not kind. The kind of laughter that doesn't need volume to cut. One of the attorneys leaned back, shaking his head. That's not how it works. Another smirked, tapping the document. It's standard language. Alicia didn't look at them. Her finger lifted, hovering just above the paper. Not touching. Never touching. Subsection C, she said. Last line. The wording shifts responsibility under dispute conditions. It looks protective, but it's not. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. His pen lowered, just a fraction. Not to sign. Not yet. His eyes dropped to the page. The room leaned in without moving. No one spoke now. No one laughed. Just the faint rustle of paper as he flipped. Once. Then again. Slower. More careful. The overhead lights reflected off the glossy surface, casting a sharp, white line across the contract. His fingers paused there, right where she had pointed. A heartbeat passed. Then another. The city outside kept moving. But inside that room, nothing did. Daniel Whitmore did not speak immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the page, scanning the line once, then again, slower this time, as if the words themselves had shifted beneath his gaze. Around the table, executives exchanged brief glances, subtle movements of discomfort passing between them like a quiet current. Someone cleared their throat, another adjusted their tie, but no one interrupted. The authority in the room had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt in the tightening air. Alicia Brooks stood exactly where she had stopped, her posture calm, shoulders relaxed, her hands now resting lightly at her sides. The cloth she had been holding slipped slightly between her fingers, forgotten. She did not look at the men who had laughed. She did not look at the security guard standing near the door. Her focus remained steady, anchored to the truth she had already spoken. Daniel's pen hovered again, but this time it did not move toward the paper. It stayed suspended, caught between decision and doubt. He flipped back one page, then forward again, tracing the paragraph with the tip of the pen without touching it, as if confirming something he did not want to confirm. Who drafted this? He asked finally, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty. The question landed heavily. The lead attorney straightened slightly, adjusting his glasses. Our legal team reviewed it in full. He replied, measured, careful. It is a standard protection clause. Daniel did not look up. It is not standard, he said quietly. Another pause followed, longer this time. the kind that stretched just enough to make everyone aware of it. A bead of sweat formed near the temple of the junior analyst seated near the end of the table. He shifted in his chair, eyes darting between the contract and Alicia, unsure where to land. The overhead lights hummed faintly, casting a steady glow across the polished surface of the table, reflecting back fragments of faces, hands, and tension. Daniel leaned back slightly, the leather of his chair creaking under the subtle shift. His gaze finally lifted from the document and moved across the room, not hurried, not aggressive, but searching. It passed over the attorneys, the executives, the advisors, and then returned to Alicia. This time, he saw her differently, not as a disruption, not as an outsider, but as someone who had stepped into a moment no one else had noticed. "Explain it," he said. The words were directed at her, clear and unmistakable. A ripple moved through the room. One of the lawyers leaned forward slightly, as if to interject, but stopped himself. Alicia inhaled softly, steadying her breath, then stepped closer to the table, just enough to see the document clearly without crossing into anyone's space. "The language in subsection C," she began, her voice even, controlled. "It appears to offer flexibility under regulatory review. But the phrasing allows the other party to redirect any post-merger liability back to your company under dispute conditions. It is written to sound neutral, but it is not balanced." She paused, letting the words settle. No one interrupted. "If anything fails after the agreement is signed," she continued, "your company carries the full responsibility. Financial, legal, all of it." Silence followed again, heavier now, more deliberate. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the pen, then loosened. He looked down at the page one more time, slower than before, as if seeing it for the first time. Then, without a word, he placed the pen flat on the table. Not dropped, not forced, just set down. And in that small, controlled movement, the entire room understood something had just changed. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like pressure releasing from a sealed room. Daniel Whitmore's hand remained still on the table, fingers resting near the pen he had just set down, as if even the smallest movement might disrupt whatever truth had just surfaced. Across from him, the lead attorney leaned forward, his expression tightening, the polished confidence he carried beginning to show fine cracks. "There may be an alternative interpretation," he said carefully, choosing each word as if it might be challenged. But his voice no longer filled the room the way it had minutes ago. It hovered, uncertain. Daniel did not respond. His eyes were still on the contract, but his focus had deepened, sharpened. He flipped to the appendix, scanning the supporting clauses, cross-referencing language, tracing the structure of the agreement with quiet precision. The faint sound of pages turning echoed louder than it should have. One executive reached for a glass of water but stopped halfway, his hand hovering in hesitation, as if even that small action felt inappropriate now. Alicia Brooks stood in place, her breathing slow, controlled. The tension in the room did not pull at her. It passed around her, over her, but did not move her. She had already stepped into the moment that mattered. Everything after this belonged to them. Daniel exhaled quietly, a subtle shift, but enough to be noticed. He leaned forward again, elbows resting lightly on the table, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but grounded in something more deliberate. "Pull up the risk assessment from the previous draft," he said without looking up. The junior analyst at the far end of the table jolted slightly, then quickly turned to his laptop, fingers moving faster than his thoughts could settle. The large screen on the wall flickered to life, numbers and projections filling the space with cold precision. Daniel's gaze lifted, following the data as it aligned with the clause in question. His jaw tightened again, but this time there was no confusion in it, only recognition. "They buried it," he said quietly. No one asked who. No one needed to. A low murmur began to ripple through the room, not loud enough to break control, but enough to reveal that understanding had spread. The deal was not what it had seemed. It never had been. Daniel's eyes moved again, slower now, until they settled back on Alicia. There was no dismissal in his expression anymore. No trace of the earlier indifference. Instead, there was something else. Something measured. Respect, perhaps, though he did not name it. "What is your name?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried weight. Alicia answered without hesitation. "Alicia Brooks." Her voice did not rise. It did not seek approval. It simply existed, steady and clear. Daniel nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then leaned back in his chair. The leather shifted beneath him with a soft sound, grounding the moment. He looked around the table, taking in each face, each person who had been ready to proceed without question. "We are not signing this," he said. The words landed firmly, leaving no room for negotiation. A breath released across the room, subtle but collective. Plans were already shifting, timelines collapsing and rebuilding in real time. But Daniel did not move on to the next step. Not yet. His gaze returned once more to Alicia, as if there was still something unfinished in the space between them. And in that quiet pause, it became clear to everyone present that the story inside this room had not ended with the contract. It had only just begun. No one reached for their notes. No one checked their phone. The room stayed suspended in that fragile space between realization and reaction, as if everyone understood that whatever came next would matter more than what had just been uncovered. Daniel Whitmore's gaze lingered on Alicia Brooks a moment longer before he finally shifted his attention back to the table. But the shift was different now, less commanding, more deliberate. "I want every clause in this agreement re-examined," he said, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier finality. Replaced by something more careful, line by line. No assumptions. The legal team nodded quickly, almost too quickly, their confidence now replaced by urgency. Papers moved, laptops reopened, fingers hovered over keys, but there was hesitation in every motion, a quiet awareness that the foundation they trusted had just been questioned by someone they had dismissed minutes earlier. Alicia remained still, her presence no longer ignored but not yet fully understood, as if the room had not decided where to place her. One of the executives finally spoke, his voice lower than before. "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" The question was not sharp, not mocking, but it carried the weight of disbelief. Alicia did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved briefly across the table, taking in the faces that now watched her differently, then settled again with calm restraint. "I read," she said simply. The answer hung there, quiet and complete, offering no explanation beyond itself. Daniel's brow shifted slightly, not in doubt, but in recognition of something he had overlooked. He stood then, slowly, the movement drawing attention without force. The chair slid back with a soft sound against the floor. When he spoke again, his voice carried through the room with a different kind of authority, one that no longer needed to assert itself. "Alicia Brooks," he said, her name clear, intentional. "You are not supposed to be invisible in this building." The words were not loud, but they landed with precision. A subtle shift moved through the room, not dramatic, but undeniable. Alicia's expression did not change, but something in her posture softened, just slightly, as if the weight of being unseen had been acknowledged, if only for a moment. Daniel stepped around the table, closing the physical distance that had defined their roles just minutes earlier. He did not rush. Each step was measured, deliberate. When he stopped a few feet from her, the contrast between them remained clear, but the space between them no longer carried the same imbalance. "Stay," he said, not as a command, not as a request, as a decision. Alicia held his gaze for a brief second, then gave a small nod. No words followed. None were needed. Behind them, the room had already begun to move again, quieter now, more careful, each person adjusting to a new understanding that had not been planned. The contract lay open on the table, no longer a path forward, but a warning. And standing just beyond it, Alicia Brooks remained exactly where she had stepped into the moment, no longer unnoticed, no longer dismissed, but not yet fully seen for what she might become. The room did not return to normal. It adjusted, slowly, like a structure forced to carry a weight it had not prepared for. Papers were no longer flipped with confidence. Voices were no longer certain. Every sentence now came with a pause, every conclusion with a second look. Daniel Whitmore remained standing for a moment longer, his attention shifting between the contract and the people around the table, but his presence had changed. It was no longer about control. It was about correction. "Run a full exposure scenario," he said, his voice measured, directing the room without raising it. "Assume worst case. I want to know exactly how much we were about to lose." The analyst at the screen nodded quickly, fingers moving across the keyboard, pulling projections, recalculating outcomes. Numbers began to shift on the display, lines adjusting, risk percentages climbing in quiet, undeniable increments. No one spoke while the data updated. The silence was heavier now, grounded in consequence rather than uncertainty. Alicia Brooks stood near the edge of the table, still within the room but not part of its structure, her presence steady, unobtrusive, yet impossible to ignore. One of the senior partners leaned toward another, whispering low enough to avoid attention, but not low enough to escape it entirely. This could have been catastrophic. The word lingered in the air, unchallenged. Daniel's eyes lifted to the screen as the final numbers settled into place. His expression did not break, but something in his posture tightened, just enough to show the weight of what had almost happened. 8 figures, the analyst said carefully, his voice controlled but edged with disbelief. At minimum, a quiet shift moved through the room. Not panic, not yet, but the kind of awareness that settles deep, the kind that does not fade quickly. Daniel nodded once, absorbing it, then turned slightly, his gaze finding Alicia again. The contrast between them remained, but the distance had changed. You saw this in minutes, he said, not as a question, but as a fact he was still processing. Alicia met his gaze, calm, composed. It stood out, she replied simply. No emphasis, no pride, just truth. One of the attorneys straightened, attempting to reclaim some footing. With respect, this was a highly technical document. It required a full legal review to interpret. Daniel raised a hand, not sharply, but enough to stop the sentence before it finished. The gesture was quiet, but absolute. It required attention, he said. The correction was precise. The attorney leaned back, silent. The room absorbed the shift without resistance. Daniel turned back to the table, his fingers resting lightly on the edge, grounding himself in the moment. From this point forward, he continued, nothing moves forward without verification. Not from title, not from position, from accuracy. His words were not directed at any one person, but everyone understood where they pointed. Alicia remained still, her role undefined, but her impact already woven into the room. A faint reflection of her figure appeared in the glass wall behind her, layered against the skyline, a quiet reminder of where she stood and where she had stepped into. Daniel glanced at that reflection for a brief second, then back to her. You noticed what everyone else missed, he said, softer now. That matters. Alicia did not respond. She did not need to. The acknowledgement itself shifted something deeper than the contract ever could. Around them, the work resumed, slower, more deliberate, each person recalibrating their place in a system that had just proven itself fallible. And in the center of it, without raising her voice, without asking for recognition, Alicia Brooks had changed the direction of everything. The room quieted in a different way now, no longer tense with conflict, but settled into something slower, heavier, almost reflective. The city light outside had shifted, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden streaks through the floor-to-ceiling windows, stretching across the marble floor and climbing the edges of the conference table. Dust particles drifted in the air, visible only because the light had found them. Alicia Brooks stood within that light without moving, the glow brushing against her shoulder, softening the outline of her uniform, turning something ordinary into something quietly striking. No one spoke to her. Not yet. But no one looked away either. Daniel Whitmore had returned to his seat, but he did not sit all the way back. His posture remained forward, elbows resting lightly on the table, fingers interlocked, as if holding onto the moment before it could pass. The contract still lay open in front of him, unchanged in form, but completely altered in meaning. He did not touch it again. Instead, his gaze shifted between the page and the reflection in the glass, where Alicia's figure stood layered over the skyline, steady, unshaken, present in a space that had not been built for her. A faint hum from the ventilation system filled the silence, steady and constant, like a quiet reminder that the world outside continued, even as something inside this room had paused. One of the executives leaned back slowly, exhaling under his breath, the sound almost lost in the stillness. Another closed a laptop halfway, then stopped, leaving it open as if unsure whether to continue or wait. Time felt suspended, stretched thin between what had almost happened and what had just been prevented. Alicia's hands rested gently at her sides now, the cloth she had been holding earlier tucked loosely between her fingers. Her shoulders rose slightly with a breath, then fell, controlled, measured. She did not look at Daniel. She did not look at the contract. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the window, where the light softened into the edges of the city, buildings catching the glow, traffic moving in slow lines far below. For a brief moment, her reflection in the glass was clearer than the city itself. A quiet presence, standing between two worlds. Daniel noticed it. Not the movement, not the breath, the stillness. He leaned back slightly, the chair responding with a soft creak, and his eyes remained on that reflection longer than necessary. Something about it held him there. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. No performance, no demand, just presence. The kind that does not ask to be seen, but changes a room when it is. His hand moved, slowly this time, not toward the pen, not toward the paper, but resting flat against the table, grounding himself in the moment. Around him, the room remained quiet, each person caught in their own recalibration, their own silent recognition of what had shifted. The numbers on the screen remained unchanged. The contract remained open. The deal remained undone. But something else had been completed. Not spoken, not written, just understood. And in the reflection of the glass, where light met stillness, Alicia Brooks stood without moving, and somehow, that was the loudest thing in the room. The silence did not last forever. It shifted, gently at first, like a breath returning after being held too long. Daniel Whitmore straightened in his chair, his gaze no longer fixed on the contract, no longer lost in the reflection, but clear now, settled with a kind of certainty that had not been there before. He reached forward, not for the pen, but for the document itself, closing it slowly, the sound of the paper folding over echoing softly across the table. It was not rejection. It was finality. Around him, the room responded in subtle ways. A laptop clicked shut. A chair adjusted. Someone exhaled more fully this time. The moment had passed, but its weight remained. Daniel stood again, this time without hesitation, and as he did, the attention of the room followed him naturally, not out of habit, but because something had changed in how they saw him as well. He was no longer just the man who led decisions. He was the one who had nearly made the wrong one, and he knew it. He stepped away from the table, moving toward the glass wall where Alicia Brooks still stood, her reflection now blending with the fading light of the city as the sun dipped lower. The sky had shifted into deeper tones, gold turning to amber, softening into early evening blue. For a brief moment, the room behind them disappeared in the reflection, leaving only two figures against the skyline. Daniel stopped a few feet from her, not closing the distance completely, not stepping into her space, but no longer separated by the invisible line that had once defined them. "You saw what none of us did," he said, his voice quieter now, not carrying across the room, but meant only for the space between them. Alicia turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded. "It was there," she replied simply. Daniel let out a slow breath, a small release, but one that carried acknowledgement. "And we missed it," he said. There was no defense in his tone, no justification, just truth. Behind them, the legal team had begun quietly gathering their materials, no longer rushing, no longer assuming, each movement careful, deliberate, as if every action now required intention. The energy in the room had shifted from urgency to accountability. Daniel's eyes moved briefly to the reflection again, then back to Alicia. "Do you know how close we were?" he asked, not as a test, but as a realization he was still processing. Alicia did not look at the contract. She did not look at the screen. "Close enough," she said. The answer was quiet, but it held everything. Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if that was the only response that fit. He glanced back toward the table, toward the people who had trusted the document, trusted the process, trusted themselves. Then he looked at her again, and this time there was no hesitation in his expression. "You changed the outcome," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight, not just of what had been avoided, but of what had been revealed. Alicia did not step forward. She did not step back. She simply stood there, steady as she had been from the beginning, her presence unchanged by the recognition, as if she had never needed it to begin with. And in that quiet exchange, with the city dimming behind them and the room slowly finding its new rhythm, Daniel Whitmore understood something he had not expected to learn that day. The most important voice in the room had not come from power, position, or experience. It had come from someone who had nothing to prove and everything to see. And that realization settled deeper than any number on a screen ever could. The room did not rush forward. It settled into a slower rhythm, one shaped by what had just been acknowledged rather than what had been avoided. Daniel Whitmore remained near the glass wall, his attention no longer divided, no longer scanning for control, but focused, deliberate, grounded in the presence standing across from him. The light outside had dimmed further, the skyline now outlined in soft blues and distant gold, the city beginning its transition into evening. Inside, the reflection on the glass held steady, two figures still framed against something larger than either of them. Daniel shifted slightly, not away, but closer by a fraction, enough to signal intention without crossing the quiet boundary Alicia Brooks had maintained since the beginning. "You did not have to say anything," he said, his voice low, measured, carrying no trace of authority, only recognition. Alicia's eyes met his, calm, unguarded. "No," she replied. "I did not." There was no weight in her tone, no expectation, just a statement. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing that, understanding that what she had done came from choice, not obligation. Behind them, the room had begun to move again in quiet coordination. Documents were being reorganized, discussions resumed in softer tones, but the energy had changed. It was no longer about closing a deal. It was about understanding what had nearly been lost. Daniel glanced briefly over his shoulder, then back to Alicia, as if confirming something within himself before continuing. "Most people in that position would have stayed silent," he said. Alicia's gaze did not shift. "Most people are told to," she answered. The words landed gently, but they carried more than explanation. They carried experience. Daniel held her gaze a moment longer, then looked down briefly, not in dismissal, but in reflection. When he looked back up, something had settled in him, something clear, resolved. "That changes today," he said. The words were not spoken to the room, not announced. They existed in the space between them, quiet but certain. Alicia did not respond immediately. Her posture remained the same, her presence unchanged, as if she had learned long ago that words did not always match outcomes. Daniel seemed to recognize that. He did not push further. Instead, he turned slightly toward the table, his voice lifting just enough to carry across the room without force. "Effective immediately, I want Alicia Brooks included in every contract review process until further notice," he said. The movement in the room paused again, not as sharply as before, but enough to mark the moment. A few heads turned. A few expressions shifted, surprise blending with something more thoughtful. No one objected. Not this time. Daniel did not look back to measure their reactions. His attention returned to Alicia, steady, direct. "You earned that," he added, quieter now. Alicia's eyes held his for a brief second longer. Then she gave a small nod. Not acceptance, not gratitude, just acknowledgement. The kind that does not depend on approval. Around them, the room adjusted again, this time not out of correction, but out of realignment. A new pattern forming, subtle but real. The contract remained closed on the table, its pages no longer a threat, but a reminder. And standing beside the glass, where light met reflection and silence carried meaning, Alicia Brooks remained exactly as she had been from the beginning. Not louder, not different, just finally placed where she should have been all along. The meeting did not end with a loud decision or a final command. It dissolved slowly, like the last lights slipping behind the skyline, each person gathering their materials with quieter hands, more thoughtful movements, as if the room itself had asked them to leave differently than they entered. Chairs slid back without urgency. Laptops closed without confidence. Conversations resumed, but softer now, measured, carrying less certainty and more awareness. Daniel Whitmore remained where he stood for a moment longer, his gaze drifting once more across the table, across the people who had trusted what they should have questioned, including himself. Then, he turned, not toward the exit, but toward the glass wall one last time. The city outside had deepened into evening, windows lighting up one by one across distant buildings, each reflection layering over the other until it became impossible to tell where the glass ended and the skyline began. Alicia Brooks was still there, her figure now part of that reflection, steady, unhurried, unchanged. She did not look back at him this time. Her attention was forward, toward the doors, toward the hallway beyond. Without a word, she turned and began to walk. Her steps were quiet against the marble, the faint echo of each one marking a transition that did not need to be announced. Daniel watched her for a second, then another, but he did not call her name. He did not stop her. Some moments were not meant to be held. They were meant to be understood. Alicia reached the door, her hand resting briefly on the handle, the cool metal catching the last trace of light from the room. For a fraction of a second, she paused, not in hesitation, but in stillness, as if allowing the weight of what had happened to settle fully before stepping beyond it. Then she opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The sound of the door closing behind her was soft, almost inaudible, but it carried a finality that lingered longer than any spoken word. Inside the room, the lights seemed dimmer now, the reflections less sharp, the space returning to something familiar but not quite the same. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand resting once more on the edge of the table where the contract had been. He looked down at the closed document, then away from it, as if its meaning had already been rewritten in his mind. Around him, the last of the team filtered out, their footsteps fading into the distance, leaving the room nearly empty. For the first time since the meeting began, there was no urgency left in the air. Only quiet. Only space. Daniel moved toward the window, standing where Alicia had been just moments earlier. He looked out at the city, at the lights, at the motion far below, but what he saw was not the skyline. It was the reflection, not of himself, but of the moment that had just passed. A moment that could not be undone, but had already changed something permanent. He remained there for a long time, not speaking, not moving, just standing in the stillness, where power had paused, truth had spoken, and silence had answered. And in that silence, something